There is a location in western New York that appears on no geological survey completed before 1890. It does not appear in the records of the Army Corps of Engineers. It is not referenced in any Iroquois oral history that has been formally transcribed. And yet, in the private correspondence of at least 3 separate excavation teams working beneath the Niagara Escarpment between 1871 and 1885, it is mentioned repeatedly. The references are indirect. The language is careful. One engineer writes simply that the lower passage did not match any formation they had been trained to expect. Another records that local Seneca men hired as guides refused to enter the third level entirely and offered no explanation. A third account, written by a mineralogist from Cornell and never formally published, describes a chamber whose walls bore markings that he could not attribute to water erosion. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Tool use, or any natural geological process he had studied. These documents exist. They are held in institutional archives. They have not been hidden. They have simply never been assembled in one place, never read in sequence, and never considered alongside what the Iroquois Confederacy was choosing not to say at exactly the same historical moment those excavations were underway. By 1885, the federal government had begun formal negotiations with Iroquois leadership over land title, resource rights, and the legal boundaries of sovereignty that had been eroding for decades. Those negotiations produced transcripts, and in those transcripts the elders of the Haudenosaunee spoke at length about rivers, about surface territory, about seasonal fishing rights, and timber access. What they did not speak about, across hundreds of pages of recorded testimony, was anything beneath the ground. That silence, in the context of what the excavation teams were finding, is not incidental. It is a choice. And choices made by people who understood the stakes of the moment are worth examining very carefully. The Niagara Escarpment is a dolostone ridge that runs from New York through Ontario, defining the southern edge of a geological formation that geologists call the Michigan Basin. The escarpment itself is the erosion-resistant edge of layered sedimentary rock deposited during the Silurian period, and it rises sharply above the surrounding lowlands in a way that has made it a prominent landscape feature for every human culture that has lived near it. The Niagara River, which drains Lake Erie into Lake Ontario, cuts through the escarpment in a way that produces the falls and the gorge that made the region famous in the 19th century. What receives considerably less attention is what lies beneath the falls themselves and beneath the surrounding plateau to the east and west. Caves are not unusual in dolostone and limestone terrain. The dissolution of carbonate rock by mildly acidic groundwater is a well-documented process. The Niagara region has documented cave systems, some of them accessible to visitors, some of them studied by geologists, some of them used historically for storage or shelter. None of this is contested. What becomes interesting is the distinction between caves that fit the expected geological model and passages that do not. The excavations that began in earnest in the early 1870s were not cave explorations in any recreational sense. They were commercial projects. The construction of tunnels, the extraction of minerals, and the engineering of water diversion channels were all driving subterranean work in the region during this period. The workers and engineers conducting this work were not romantically inclined toward mystery. They were operating under contract, under schedule, and under the economic pressure that defined industrial extraction in postbellum America. When their reports note something unexpected, they note it briefly, without elaboration, because elaboration was not their job. But the frequency with which something unexpected appears in those reports, across multiple independent projects, across more than a decade of work, is worth counting. The passage that appears in the 1874 report of the Niagara Hydraulic Survey is a single sentence. It describes a formation encountered at approximately 40 feet below the established water table in a location the survey team designated as Section F, Northeast Quadrant. The formation, the report states, appeared to have been worked, not eroded, not fractured by geological pressure. Worked. The report does not elaborate. The survey continues, notes standard dolostone characteristics in the surrounding rock, and moves on. The word worked is used without quotation marks, without hedging, without any indication that the writer felt it required explanation. It is the kind of sentence that rewards attention precisely because it does not seek it. In 1877, a separate excavation team working on a private project to develop a subterranean cistern system below a commercial property on the Canadian side of the falls encountered a passage that had not appeared on any prior survey. The passage ran roughly northeast by southwest. Its ceiling height varied between 7 and 11 feet. Its floor was not bare rock. The engineer who documented the discovery noted that the floor material appeared to be a compressed composite, darker than the surrounding dolostone, and that it did not respond to standard pick and shovel work in the way raw stone would. He requested additional equipment. The project owner, whose correspondence has survived in a collection held at the University of Toronto, wrote back asking whether the passage could be incorporated into the cistern design. The engineer replied that he would need more time to assess its extent. There are no further letters on the subject. The cistern was completed in 1878. Its final construction drawings do not show the passage. The passage disappeared from the record, not because anyone destroyed the record, because no one added to it. This is the pattern that recurs. Something is found. It is noted, briefly and practically. It does not fit the expected framework. No one has the time or the mandate to investigate it. The project continues. The finding dissolves into administrative silence. And the archive that results looks, to a casual reader, like an archive of routine industrial work, because most of it is. The anomalies are a small fraction of a large body of documentation. But they cluster. They cluster geographically along the escarpment. They cluster in the depth range between 30 and 60 feet below the surface, and they cluster temporally in the years between 1871 and 1885. That temporal clustering matters because it coincides precisely with the period during which Iroquois leadership was engaged in formal, high-stakes negotiation with American and Canadian federal authorities. The Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse, had maintained political cohesion through the Iroquois Confederacy for centuries before European contact, and the structure of that confederacy, with its sophisticated protocols for consensus, for the preservation of knowledge across generations, and for the management of information between internal and external audiences, had allowed them to navigate colonial pressure in ways that many other nations had not survived. The elders who appeared before federal negotiating commissions in the 1870s and 1880s were not naive. They were deeply skilled political actors who understood that what they said in those proceedings would become a permanent legal record. They understood that what they acknowledged as known could potentially become a basis for claim. And they understood, in ways that the federal commissioners across the table from them almost certainly did not, what kinds of knowledge carried what kinds of risk. The formal transcripts of Iroquois testimony from the land and resource negotiations of this period have been studied extensively by historians of Native American law, sovereignty, and diplomacy. Those studies have focused, reasonably, on what the elders said about surface territory, about treaty rights, about the boundaries that had been drawn and redrawn across their lands. Considerably less attention has been paid to the structural gaps in what was discussed. There is a category of knowledge in Iroquois epistemology that has no direct English equivalent, though it is sometimes translated as keeper knowledge or protected knowledge, meaning knowledge that belongs to a specific clan or society, and that is not to be transmitted outside that context, regardless of circumstance. The elders at the federal negotiations were not simply choosing to be silent about certain things. They were fulfilling a categorical obligation. The question is what category of knowledge they were protecting, and why that protection was being exercised with such precision at this specific historical moment. The Seneca Nation, the westernmost of the 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee, held primary territorial relationship with the Niagara region. Seneca cosmology, in its accounts that have been formally documented, contains references to what translators have rendered as the world beneath the world, a domain that is neither the surface realm of human habitation nor the celestial realm of sky beings, but a third space that lies below. This framing is not unusual in indigenous cosmologies across North America. What is notable in the Seneca accounts is the specificity with which certain landscape features are associated with access to this lower realm. The falls are present in these accounts, the gorge is present, and there are references, in materials collected by ethnographers in the 1880s and 1890s, to passages in the rock that served as thresholds, as boundaries between states of being, as locations that required specific protocols of approach. These accounts were collected after the period of peak sensitivity. The Seneca who shared them with ethnographers were doing so within a specific context, and what they shared was a shaped version of a larger body of knowledge. But even the shaped version contains directional information. It points toward the escarpment. It points towards specific geological features. It describes the passages as real physical locations, not metaphors. And the ethnographers who collected these accounts, trained to interpret indigenous cosmology as symbolic rather than referential, did exactly what their training prepared them to do. They catalogued the information as mythology. They noted the imagery as spiritually significant. They did not ask whether the passages being described were the same passages that industrial excavation teams were encountering below the surface of the plateau at almost exactly the same time. In 1881, a geological survey commissioned by the state of New York conducted a systematic examination of cave formations in the Niagara frontier region. The survey produced a report of considerable length and technical detail. It documented several known cave systems, provided mineralogical analysis of the dolostone, and noted the hydrological connections between surface water features and subterranean drainage. On page 47 of the report, in a section dealing with anomalous formations in the northeast quadrant of the survey area, the author includes a paragraph that has received no scholarly attention in the intervening century and a half. The paragraph describes a formation at depth that the survey team chose not to map in detail because its extent exceeded the scope of the commission and would have required equipment not available to the team at the time. The author notes that the formation appeared to be connected to a larger system. He estimates, conservatively, that the passage he observed extended for at least several hundred feet before reaching a point beyond which his lamp could not illuminate. He notes the geometry of the ceiling as regular, in a way inconsistent with natural dissolution patterns. And he notes, in the final sentence of the paragraph, that markings were observed on the eastern wall, the nature of which was not immediately determinable by the survey team. He moves on. The report continues with dolostone mineralogy. The paragraph sits on page 47 of a document that has been digitized but not indexed for content. To find it, you have to read the document. The researchers who consult the 1881 survey are looking for hydrological data. They do not reach page 47. The markings described in the 1881 survey are not unique in the documentary record of this region. Similar observations appear in at least 4 other documents from the period between 1871 and 1888. None of them is specific. The language is always hedged, always brief, always embedded in a report about something else. What is consistent across all of them is the location. The observations cluster in the northeast quadrant of the survey area, at depth, in a geological zone that the Seneca geographic accounts associate with what the translated texts call the lower threshold. None of this constitutes proof of anything. That is worth stating directly. What is being described here is a pattern of independent documentation, a pattern of conspicuous omission in a parallel body of oral record, and a series of individual observations that do not fit the expected model of the geological environment. The standard interpretation of such a pattern is coincidence, the noise inherent in any large body of historical documentation. The alternative interpretation requires a set of premises that established academic frameworks are structurally unable to accommodate. Those premises begin with the possibility that the Niagara escarpment contains, At depth, structures that are not the product of natural geological processes and not the product of any known historical human engineering program. The dollarstone of the escarpment is old. The geological record for the region is well established. Any structures at depth would have to predate the geological formations surrounding them, or be integrated into those formations in a way that is inconsistent with anything in the documented record of human construction. This is not a small claim. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. It is, by the standards of conventional, historical and geological scholarship, an extraordinary claim. And yet the documentary record, assembled carefully and read without the assumption that the extraordinary cannot be true, keeps pointing in the same direction. The Tartarian interpretive framework, which approaches pre-modern and pre-colonial landscape features, with the assumption that a sophisticated global civilization preceded the one whose history we have formally documented, offers a set of questions that conventional scholarship does not ask, not answers. Questions: were the passages beneath the Niagara Escarpment constructed by a civilization whose existence precedes the geological context that now surrounds them? Was the knowledge of those passages preserved in Haudenosaunee oral tradition as protected knowledge, precisely because it carried information about a prior world that the emerging American state would not have been able to incorporate into its legal or epistemic framework? And if so, was the silence of the elders in 1885 not evasion, but the most sophisticated form of preservation available to them? These questions cannot be answered by the available documentation. That is precisely what makes them worth asking. Consider what the elders were facing in 1885. The legal negotiations underway were not abstract. They concerned land, resources, and the survival of political structures that had endured for centuries, but were under unprecedented pressure. The federal commissioners they faced were operating within a legal system that recognized only certain categories of claim: surface land, water rights, hunting territory. The framework had no category for subterranean structural heritage. It had no mechanism for acknowledging, let alone protecting, knowledge of passages beneath the plateau that did not conform to any known geological or historical model. To name those passages in a federal negotiating context would have been to introduce a category of claim that the other side of the table was completely unequipped to process, and that might have triggered responses ranging from dismissal to active suppression. The elders chose silence, and the silence held. The excavation teams working below the surface in those same years were operating under entirely different pressures. They had contracts to fulfill, deadlines to meet, and investors to report to. When they encountered something that did not fit, they noted it and moved on. The economic logic of industrial extraction does not accommodate lengthy investigation of anomalies. The anomaly gets recorded because the engineer is thorough and because the record is necessary for contractual accountability, but the anomaly does not get followed. The passage gets passed. The project continues. And the document that results looks like a document about a cistern or a hydraulic survey or a mineralogical assessment, because that is what it is. The anomaly is incidental. It is only in retrospect, when the anomalies from multiple independent projects are read together, that a picture begins to form. In 1885, the same year that the land negotiations produced their most extensive transcripts of Iroquois testimony, a group of private investors in Buffalo financed a survey of potential quarry sites along the Canadian portion of the escarpment. The survey team was small, 3 engineers and 4 local labourers, and its records are held in a private collection that has not been fully catalogued. What has been reviewed from that collection includes a field notebook kept by the lead engineer. In that notebook, in an entry dated September of 1885, the engineer describes reaching a point in a natural fissure at approximately 50 feet below the surface where the fissure opened into a larger space. He estimates the space to be roughly 40 feet in diameter. He describes the floor as flat, in a way inconsistent with natural rock formation at that depth. He describes the walls as smooth beyond what water erosion typically produces in dolostone at this geological age. And he describes, in careful language that suggests he is trying to be precise about something that resists precise language, a series of forms visible on the far wall that he cannot account for. He does not use the word markings. He does not use the word carvings. He writes that the wall surface on the eastern side of the chamber bore evidence of deliberate arrangement. He underlines the word deliberate. He makes no further comment. The following entry in the notebook is dated 4 days later and concerns a completely different portion of the survey area. There is no indication of what happened in those 4 days. The entry gives no explanation for the gap. The survey continued. The quarry project was eventually abandoned for reasons that the financial records attribute entirely to unfavorable dolostone composition in the target area. The field notebook ends with a summary entry in a different hand from the main body of the text, suggesting it was completed by someone other than the engineer who kept it. That detail is unusual enough to be worth noting. Field notebooks in commercial surveying contexts were personal documents. They were the working record of one individual. The appearance of a second hand in the summary entry suggests the notebook was completed by someone else after the lead engineer was no longer in a position to complete it himself. The private collection in which the notebook is held offers no biographical information about the engineer beyond his surname. What happened to him is not recorded. This is not the only document from this period where the record ends in a way that leaves questions. It is, however, the most explicit. And its explicitness is precisely its limitation, because the most explicit evidence is also the most easily dismissed as anecdote, as coincidence, as the product of overworked men in difficult conditions, allowing their imaginations to inform their technical language. That dismissal is available. It is also comfortable. Comfort is not a reliable guide to historical understanding. The geological literature on the Niagara Escarpment is extensive. The historiography of Iroquois diplomacy in the late 19th century is substantial. The industrial archaeology of commercial excavation projects in western New York during the same period is considerably thinner, partly because commercial records were not systematically preserved, and partly because no scholarly framework existed to frame those records as historically significant. What this means in practical terms is that the three bodies of documentation that, read together, generate the questions this script has been examining have never been read together. They belong to different disciplines. They are held in different archives. They are indexed under different categories. And the people who have read one of them thoroughly have generally had no reason to read the others. This is how anomalies survive in the historical record, not because anyone destroys them. Because the record is large, and the anomalies are small, and the frameworks that would connect them do not exist within established scholarship, the framework has to be built from outside. And building it from outside requires accepting the risk that the connections being drawn are real, not imposed, not the product of motivated reasoning, not a pattern found because the finder was looking for it. The question of who built what beneath the Niagara Escarpment cannot be answered by pointing to any known historical population and saying, these people had the tools, the knowledge, and the motivation to do this. The Haudenosaunee themselves, the most historically documented inhabitants of the region, have no tradition of subterranean construction of the scale that the 1881 survey and the 1885 field notebook describe. The passages noted by excavation teams are not attributed in any indigenous oral tradition to the ancestors of the Iroquois nations. They are described, where they are described at all, as having already existed when the first human beings arrived at the surface above them. That is a consistent pattern across the shaped versions of the oral record that have been made available to outside observers. The passages were found, not made, by the people who then built their understanding of them into the cosmological frameworks that organize their relationship with the landscape. This is a meaningful distinction. It is the difference between ancestral construction and inherited encounter. The Haudenosaunee did not claim to have built the passages. They claimed to know what the passages were, and that knowledge, encoded in clan-specific traditions that outsiders were not permitted to access, was precisely what the elders in 1885 were protecting. Not their own people's engineering history, something older. Something that predated the arrival of any human culture at the surface of the Niagara Plateau and that had been incorporated into Haudenosaunee knowledge systems over time as a category of sacred geography, a feature of the world that required specific protocols because it connected to states and systems that lay beyond ordinary human experience. The distinction between discovering and building carries considerable weight in the Tartarian interpretive framework. The hypothesis that a pre-existing global civilization constructed infrastructure that later human populations inherited, adapted, and incorporated into their own knowledge systems does not require that every culture in contact with remnant structures understood what those structures originally were or what they were originally for. It requires only that the structures exist, that they predate the cultures that encountered them, and that those cultures responded to them in ways that reflect the depth and strangeness of what they found. The Haudenosaunee response, encoded in protected knowledge and exercised through strategic silence at the moment of greatest political pressure, is entirely consistent with that model. The Iroquois silence of 1885 is real. It is present in the transcripts. It has been noted by scholars of Indigenous diplomacy as an example of strategic restraint in a high-pressure negotiating context. That interpretation is not wrong. The elders were exercising strategic restraint. The question is what they were strategically restraining. The conventional answer is they were protecting territorial claims that could not be articulated within the legal framework available to them. That answer is sufficient within a conventional framework. It stops being sufficient when you read the excavation records alongside the transcripts. When you read those documents together, strategic restraint about territorial claims becomes, potentially, something considerably more specific. It becomes the protection of knowledge about what lies beneath specific points on the landscape they were negotiating over. Whether that knowledge concerned natural passages of unusual geological character, or structures that cannot be attributed to natural processes, or something for which there is currently no adequate category in either scientific or historical understanding, is not determinable from the available record. What is determinable is that multiple independent observers encountered something below the Niagara Escarpment in the years between 1871 and 1885 that they could not explain within their existing frameworks. That the people who held the deepest traditional knowledge of that landscape were actively choosing not to speak about it in the one formal context where such speech would have entered the permanent legal record, and that the record produced by both of those realities has been sitting in archives, uncombined, unread in sequence, and unexamined as a unified question for 140 years. That is long enough. The dollarstone of the escarpment is still there. The passages that were noted and not mapped are still below the surface. The Niagara River still cuts through the rock above them. And the transcripts from 1885 still contain the silences of people who knew exactly what they were not saying and why. What the Iroquois elders refused to say in 1885 may not be recoverable in full. The protected knowledge of specific clans and societies does not survive in the archival record by definition, but its shape is visible in what surrounds it. The absence of certain topics from hundreds of pages of testimony, the clustering of unexplained observations in a specific geographic and geological zone, the field notebook completed in a different hand, the engineer who does not appear in later records, the paragraph on page 47 that no one reads, because they stopped at page 30. The shape of a silence tells you where the sound would have been. What was beneath the Niagara Escarpment in 1885 is a question that the available record cannot answer, and that no one with the tools to investigate it has yet chosen to ask. That may change. The archives are still open, the ground is still there, and the pattern, once seen, is not easily unseen. Whatever the elders were protecting, they protected it completely. That is, in itself, a remarkable fact about the sophistication and discipline of the knowledge systems they maintained. That it has taken 140 years for anyone to notice the shape of what they were not saying may say as much about the limitations of the frameworks we use to read the past as it does about the past itself. The ground holds its record longer than we hold ours.